It was supposed to be an ordinary afternoon. Jason Carter, a software engineer who worked remotely, had finally found time to reset his Wi-Fi password after noticing unusual slowdowns in his internet connection. He stood on his front porch, phone in hand, updating his network settings. But in a world where assumptions often carry more weight than facts, that simple action turned into something far more dangerous. From across the street, his neighbor, Karen Mitchell, watched with narrowed eyes. She had always been wary of Jason, not because he had ever done anything wrong, but because he didn't quite fit in. He kept to himself, rarely attended neighborhood gatherings, and had an air of quiet confidence that unsettled her. And now, there he was, standing outside, staring intently at his phone. To Karen, it looked suspicious. Was he hacking something? Was he trying to access someone else's network? Her mind raced with worst-case scenarios, and before she could second-guess herself, she picked up the phone and dialed 911. The call was brief. "There's a man outside doing something strange with his phone," she said, her voice tense. "I don't know what he's up to, but it looks wrong." Minutes later, police sirens echoed through the quiet suburban street. Jason looked up, startled, as 2 squad cars pulled up in front of his house. Officers stepped out, their hands resting near their belts. He exhaled slowly. He had seen situations like this escalate before. "Sir, we received a call about suspicious activity," one officer said, his voice steady but firm. "Can you tell us what you're doing?" Jason met his gaze, his face unreadable. "I'm changing my Wi-Fi password." A tense silence followed. But what happened next turned the situation into something even Karen hadn't expected. Because as the officers checked Jason's network, they discovered something far worse than a misunderstanding. Someone in the neighborhood had been watching people through their own security cameras. And the real threat wasn't Jason at all. What started as an assumption had almost cost an innocent man his dignity, or worse. But in the end, the truth had a way of exposing itself. Jason Carter stood still, his phone in hand as the officers exchanged glances. The weight of the moment pressed against him, familiar in a way that made his stomach tighten. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, standing in his own driveway, being questioned like a suspect. He kept his voice calm, his posture relaxed. He knew that any sudden movement, any misplaced frustration, could turn a misunderstanding into something far worse. Karen Mitchell, still standing on her porch, folded her arms as if waiting for validation. She had called 911 with certainty, convinced that she had done the right thing. After all, wasn't she just protecting the neighborhood? But as she watched the officers scroll through Jason's Wi-Fi settings, she noticed something shift in their expressions. What had started as a routine check was now turning into something far more serious. One of the officers frowned at the screen. "There's an unknown device connected to your network," he said. Jason leaned in, already knowing what was coming. He had noticed it too, a device he didn't recognize, something labeled with an odd name that suggested it didn't belong. "Yeah," he said, his voice steady. "I've been having connection issues. Someone's been on my network, and I don't think they were just using my internet." A tense pause filled the air as the officer tapped into the activity logs. The information on the screen was chilling. The unknown device had been accessing security camera feeds, Jason's and possibly others in the neighborhood. The officer's face darkened. This isn't just Wi-Fi theft. Someone's been watching people. Karen's arms dropped to her sides. The certainty she had felt minutes ago was gone, replaced by an unease that settled deep in her chest. She had been so sure she was doing the right thing, so quick to assume that Jason was the problem. But now, the real danger was revealing itself, and it had nothing to do with the man she had called the police on. Instead, the truth was unfolding in a way none of them had expected. The realization hit Jason Carter first, a slow unraveling of facts that turned a petty accusation into something far more sinister. As the officer scrolled through the router's activity logs, the truth became undeniable. The unknown device wasn't just leeching off his Wi-Fi. It had been accessing private security cameras. Jason's stomach tightened as he followed the connections, his fingers moving quickly over the laptop keyboard. The logs didn't lie. Whoever was behind this had been watching him, monitoring his home, and, judging by the additional connections, spying on others in the neighborhood as well. Officer Reynolds stiffened beside him, his professional detachment giving way to a frown of concern. "These aren't just random data spikes," he muttered. "Someone's been running surveillance." His partner, Officer Lane, stepped closer, peering at the screen. "This is targeted," she said grimly. "This isn't some teenager stealing bandwidth. This is calculated." Jason exhaled sharply, his mind racing through the implications. His home, his privacy, violated by a stranger hiding behind a screen. The thought made his skin crawl. He turned to Karen Mitchell, who stood frozen on her porch, her confidence from earlier now replaced with an unsettling awareness. She had been so sure of her suspicions, so quick to assume Jason was the threat, that she hadn't stopped to consider anything else. Now, faced with the stark reality that the true danger had been lurking unseen, her face paled. "Wait," she whispered. "Are you saying someone's been watching me too?" Jason's eyes didn't leave her. "Not just you," he said. "All of us." A shudder passed through her. The weight of her mistake was crushing, but worse than that was the fear creeping into her voice. It was no longer about a false accusation, no longer about a misunderstanding rooted in bias. It was about something bigger, something deeply invasive and disturbing. And as the officers began tracing the signal's source, a dark truth loomed over them. The enemy wasn't standing in Jason's driveway. It was hidden in the walls of their own neighborhood, watching, waiting, and undetected. Until now. The truth had been hiding in plain sight, nestled in the quiet comfort of a suburban home, masquerading as nothing more than an ordinary residence. But when the officers traced the origin of the unauthorized surveillance, the unsettling reality settled in. This wasn't some far-off hacker operating from behind an anonymous screen. The person responsible was just a few doors down. Jason Carter clenched his jaw as Officer Reynolds read the address aloud. He knew it well. Everyone in the neighborhood did. It belonged to Brandon Mitchell, Karen's 22-year-old nephew, who had moved in with her a few months ago. Jason had never given much thought to the quiet young man who rarely made eye contact and always seemed glued to his laptop. But now, everything clicked. The rogue device, the hacked cameras, the eerie sense that someone had been watching. It all pointed back to him. Karen's face went pale as she whispered, "That's a mistake." But her voice lacked conviction. Deep down, she knew it wasn't. A storm of emotions played across her face. Denial, disbelief, and then something heavier. Guilt. She had called the police on Jason over nothing, convinced that his mere presence was cause for suspicion. And yet the real threat had been inside her own home the entire time. Officer Lane didn't hesitate. "We need to speak to him. Now." Karen hesitated, her hands shaking as she reached for her front door. She wanted to believe there was an explanation, something that would make sense of it all. But the moment she stepped inside, the dread in her stomach turned to certainty. Upstairs, she heard it. A chair scraping, hurried movement, the sound of a door clicking shut. Brandon knew, and he was trying to cover his tracks. The officers moved in swiftly, climbing the stairs with purpose. Karen lingered at the bottom, her pulse hammering in her ears. She had spent years believing she was a good judge of character, that she could tell right from wrong, danger from safety. And yet, she had been so quick to see Jason as a threat, while the real danger had been sitting across from her at dinner every night. Brandon Mitchell sat stiffly on the edge of his bed, his laptop still open, the screen casting a cold glow across his face. His hands clenched into fists as the officers stepped into the room, their expressions unreadable but firm. He had known this moment was coming the second he heard the knock at the door, the weight of his actions settling onto his shoulders like a suffocating blanket. Karen stood behind them, her face drawn, her breath unsteady. She wanted to defend him, to insist that this was some kind of misunderstanding. But deep down, she already knew the truth. Officer Reynolds spoke first, his voice even. "Brandon, we need to ask you some questions about unauthorized access to private security feeds. Your IP address has been linked to a surveillance breach." Brandon let out a shaky breath, his eyes darting between the officers and his aunt. I didn't mean for it to be a big deal," he muttered. "It started as a joke. Just curiosity." Karen's stomach turned. Curiosity. That was all this was to him? The invasion of people's homes, the violation of their privacy, the sickening realization that he had been watching them without their knowledge. It was all just a game? Officer Lane folded his arms. "So, you admit it? You hacked into private networks and accessed security cameras?" Brandon hesitated, then gave a small nod. "I didn't think it would go this far. I just wanted to see if I could do it." A stunned silence filled the room. Karen closed her eyes, as if willing herself to wake up from this nightmare. She had spent the past hour so convinced that Jason was the problem, so certain that she had done the right thing by calling the police. And yet, here she was, standing in front of the real culprit, the boy she had raised, the nephew she had trusted. Officer Reynolds reached for his cuffs. "Brandon Mitchell, you're under arrest for unauthorized access of a computer network and unlawful surveillance." As the handcuffs clicked around his wrists, Karen finally understood what it meant to be truly blindsided. The person she feared had been the wrong one all along. As the officers led Brandon Mitchell out of the house in handcuffs, Karen stood frozen in the doorway, her mind reeling from the weight of her mistake. She had been so sure, so convinced that Jason was the problem. She had seen him as suspicious simply because he kept to himself, because he didn't fit the mold of what she thought a neighbor should be. And now, the truth had hit her like a tidal wave. Jason had done nothing wrong. The real danger had been inside her own home the entire time. Jason stood a few yards away, his expression unreadable. He had been the one falsely accused, the one questioned by police, the one made to feel like he was a suspect in his own neighborhood. And yet, it was Jason who uncovered the truth. He hadn't lashed out. He hadn't sought revenge. He had simply let the facts speak for themselves. And now, Karen had to live with the knowledge that she had turned the police on an innocent man, all because of her own biases. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "Jason, I was wrong." The words felt inadequate. They wouldn't undo the embarrassment he had endured, the assumption she had so easily made. Jason studied her for a long moment before shaking his head. "I don't need an apology," he said. "Just do better." The simplicity of his words stung. He wasn't angry, but he wasn't about to let her off the hook either. And maybe that was the lesson she needed most. Assumptions have consequences. Bias, unchecked, has consequences. She had been so sure that she was looking out for her neighborhood, but in the end, she had let her own fears cloud her judgment. As the squad car pulled away, carrying Brandon toward the reality of his choices, Karen was left standing there with the uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the real danger isn't what we fear most. Sometimes it's what we refuse to see. As Jason turned and walked back toward his house, the weight of the moment settled heavily in the air. The neighborhood had been watching, some from behind their curtains, others standing in their yards, unsure of what to say or how to react. What had started as a routine afternoon had escalated into an ugly display of misplaced suspicion, a stark reminder of how quickly assumptions could spiral into something dangerous. And now, as the truth unraveled, the question lingered. What would people take away from this moment? For Karen, the reality was sinking in like a slow-moving tide, relentless and undeniable. She had called the police on Jason without any real evidence, without a second thought. She had seen him as a threat simply because of a feeling, an unspoken bias she had never truly confronted. But bias doesn't need to be spoken aloud to cause harm. It operates in the quiet spaces of the mind, shaping how we see the world, influencing decisions we don't even realize we're making. And today, that bias had nearly cost an innocent man his dignity, his safety, and possibly even his life. The irony was almost unbearable. While she had been so focused on Jason, convinced that he was the one up to no good, the true violation had been happening under her own roof. Her own nephew, Brandon, had spent months spying on unsuspecting neighbors, exploiting their privacy in ways she hadn't even imagined. It was his betrayal she should have feared. It was his actions that put the neighborhood at risk. Yet she had been blind to it because it was easier to look for danger in someone she already distrusted than to acknowledge the uncomfortable possibility that it could come from within. As Jason closed his front door behind him, Karen stood motionless on the sidewalk, wrestling with a realization that would stay with her for a long time. Trust isn't just about familiarity. It's about fairness. And fear, when left unchecked, has a way of leading people down a dangerous path. Today, she had learned that the hard way. The question now was whether she would let that lesson change her. The weight of what had just happened hung over the neighborhood like an unshakable storm cloud. Karen stood frozen, her mind replaying every decision, every assumption, every moment that had led to this. She had thought she was doing the right thing, acting on a gut feeling, a vague sense of unease that she had mistaken for intuition. But now, as she stood there watching her nephew being led away in handcuffs, she realized the painful truth. Her fears had been misplaced, her judgment deeply flawed. She had called the police on an innocent man while the real danger had been just down the hall in her own home. The shame was suffocating. She had been so sure of herself, so convinced that Jason was the one who didn't belong, the one who had to be watched. She had thought she was protecting the neighborhood, but in reality, she had only exposed her own bias, her own unwillingness to see past a narrative she had unknowingly accepted as truth. And Jason, how must he have felt? To be confronted, questioned, treated like a suspect for simply standing outside his own home. To know that his word alone wasn't enough to clear his name, that even his innocence needed to be proven through outside validation. Her assumptions had consequences. They always do. And this time, they had nearly derailed a man's life. She had believed she was being vigilant, but all she had done was contribute to the same problem she would have sworn she wasn't a part of. The realization stung. She had been so focused on what she thought Jason was capable of that she had ignored the truth about Brandon, someone she had trusted implicitly. And now her mistake would follow her, a shadow she could never quite escape. As the police car pulled away, Karen felt the weight of the stares from the neighbors who had witnessed it all. She wanted to disappear, to rewind time, to take back the phone call that had set this all in motion. But it was too late for that. The only thing she could do now was acknowledge the truth, sit with it, and let it change her. Because if she didn't, she knew she would be doomed to make the same mistake again. As Karen stood alone in the quiet street, the weight of her mistake settled deep in her chest. She had spent years believing she was a good person, someone who made fair judgments, who looked out for her community. But today, she had been forced to face an uncomfortable truth. She had misjudged a man based on nothing but her own biases, and in doing so, she had nearly destroyed his sense of safety in his own home. The realization stung more than she was prepared for. She had always thought of herself as reasonable, fair-minded, and cautious. But now she had to ask herself the hard question. If Jason had looked different, if he had fit her idea of what belonged, would she have made that call? The truth was undeniable. She hadn't called the police because she saw a crime happening. She had called because she felt uncomfortable. And that discomfort had come from years of unspoken, unchallenged assumptions, the kind passed down through conversations at dinner tables, in the way people talked about certain types of neighbors, in the way fear was so easily attached to people who didn't fit into the narrow expectations of the community. She had called 911 with conviction, believing she was preventing something bad from happening, when in reality, she had been the one causing harm. And the irony of it all was unbearable. The real danger, the real crime, had been unfolding right inside her own home, committed by the person she never once suspected. Shame sat heavy in her stomach. She wanted to fix it, to undo the damage, but some things couldn't be undone. The best she could do now was learn, to sit with her discomfort instead of pushing it aside. to examine the prejudices she never realized she had and do the hard work of unlearning them. And most of all, to understand that an apology wasn't enough. She had to change, not just in words, but in actions. Because assumptions have consequences, and next time, someone else might not be lucky enough to walk away. The weight of assumptions is a dangerous thing. It can turn neighbors into strangers, fear into justification, and ignorance into action. For Karen, that weight now sat heavy on her chest, pressing against her ribs with the force of a realization she couldn't escape. She had always thought of herself as someone who saw things clearly, who understood the world in a way that was fair and reasonable. But in the span of one afternoon, she had been proven wrong, not by anyone else, but by her own actions, her own thoughts, her own deeply ingrained biases that she had never dared to question. It wasn't just about making a mistake. Mistakes happen all the time. But this was something more. She had taken an innocent moment, a man updating his own Wi-Fi password, and turned it into something sinister in her mind. And that was the part that hurt the most. She had let fear win. She had let prejudice whisper in her ear, convincing her that what she saw had to be suspicious, not because of what Jason was doing, but because of who he was. She had let an unspoken, unchallenged belief guide her to pick up the phone, to call the police, to set into motion an event that could have had far worse consequences. But the worst part wasn't just that she had been wrong. It was that she had been looking in the wrong direction the entire time. While she was focused on Jason, while she was convincing herself that he was the problem, the real violation was happening under her own roof. It was her nephew, Brandon, who had been invading the privacy of their neighbors, exploiting trust, and committing a crime that went far beyond a simple misunderstanding. And now, as he was led away in handcuffs, Karen was left standing alone, forced to confront a reality she had never wanted to see. Regret wasn't enough. An apology wasn't enough. She knew that now. What she did next, how she chose to change, how she chose to see the world moving forward, that was the only thing that mattered. Because assumptions have consequences. And this time, she had nearly let hers ruin a life. Assumptions shape the world in ways we rarely acknowledge. They determine who we trust, who we fear, and who we decide belongs. But when those assumptions go unchecked, they become dangerous. They justify the unjustifiable, excuse the inexcusable, and, in the worst cases, ruin lives. Karen had never seen herself as someone who made dangerous assumptions. She believed she was a good person, a responsible neighbor, someone who just wanted to keep her community safe. But standing alone in the fading light of the evening, watching as her nephew was led away in handcuffs, she felt the crushing weight of her mistake settle deep in her chest. She had thought she was doing the right thing. She had seen a man outside, tapping on his phone, and she had convinced herself that something was wrong. He wasn't causing harm. He wasn't breaking the law. He was simply minding his own business. But in her mind, that wasn't enough. In her mind, his presence alone was reason enough to be suspicious. And so she had picked up the phone and made a decision that could have changed Jason's life forever. But it wasn't Jason who was the threat. It wasn't Jason who had been sneaking into people's lives, spying on them, invading their privacy. The real danger had been right under her nose the entire time. The truth burned through her, a painful realization that made her stomach turn. She had been looking in the wrong direction. She had called the police on a man who had done nothing wrong, while the real criminal had been living in her own house, sitting at her dinner table, carrying her last name. And now, Brandon was facing the consequences of his actions, as he should. But what about her? What were the consequences of her mistake? An apology wouldn't be enough. This wasn't about one bad decision. It was about the way she saw the world, the way she had been conditioned to see people like Jason as a threat without even questioning why. That had to change. She had to change. Because assumptions have consequences, and this time, she had nearly let hers destroy an innocent man's life. The story of Brandon Foster and the mistaken assumptions of his aunt, Karen, serves as a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained biases can influence our actions and decisions. At first glance, Karen's actions might seem justifiable. She saw something unusual, something that triggered her instincts to act, but she acted on suspicion rather than fact. What she didn't realize was that the real threat was not the person she suspected, but her own biases that clouded her judgment and led to a life-changing mistake. The consequences of that mistake were severe, not just for Brandon, but for Karen as well. She had to face the uncomfortable truth that her assumptions were wrong and that her actions, based on those assumptions, nearly destroyed an innocent person's life. This story teaches us several important lessons. First, it underscores the dangers of making snap judgments, particularly when those judgments are based on preconceived notions about someone's race, background, or appearance. It highlights the importance of questioning our own biases before acting on them. Every person deserves to be seen for who they are, not what we assume them to be. The impact of assumptions, whether subtle or overt, can be devastating, both for the person targeted and for the person making the assumptions. Karen's regret came too late, but it is a reminder that our actions, even those made in the heat of the moment, can have lasting consequences. Second, this story serves as a call for self-reflection and growth. Karen, upon realizing her mistake, didn't just apologize to Brandon. She had to challenge her worldview, confront her biases, and commit to doing better. This is a crucial part of any personal growth, acknowledging our shortcomings and making a conscious effort to change. The process may not be easy, but it is necessary if we are to move toward a more just and inclusive society. Finally, this story reminds us that true justice is about understanding, empathy, and fairness. It's about seeing beyond our assumptions and giving people the benefit of the doubt. We must all strive to look at each individual with an open mind, free of judgment, and treat them with the dignity they deserve. When we allow our biases to cloud our vision, we contribute to a cycle of injustice that harms everyone involved. This story isn't just about one woman's mistake. It's about the bigger picture, the need to challenge assumptions, confront biases, and stand up for what's right. It's about creating a world where everyone is treated equally, no matter their race, background, or appearance. If this story has resonated with you, if you believe in the fight for justice and equality, then join us at Civil Rights Fight. Together, we can create a world where the truth always prevails and where no one is judged based on their appearance, but by the content of their character. Subscribe now and be part of the movement for change.